Well, I think everybody has a different list of countries that they consider to be the ones that count as rising powers, and it's, I think, one of these debates and discussions in which you can have an awful lot of fun with, but ultimately you're never going to resolve to everybody's satisfaction. One of the really interesting things, I think, for considering this question right now is that the definition of what constitutes power in the international system is changing. I mean, it used to be pretty easy to figure out who the rising powers were in the 19th century, because you just figure out, who's putting the big battleships, out to sea. And there were good, static measures of military force and the like that you could capture. And I mean, clearly, military force is, one of the measures of who counts as a rising power, in our day and age as well. But with the changes in the global economy, with globalization and whatnot, there are a whole host of other factors: economic, social, political, diplomatic, cultural, ideological, that also get folded into the mix. And so you can have a city-state like Singapore that you wouldn't normally consider to be a world power. Because it doesn't have a sizable military, it doesn't really rate on many of the the standard indices that you would use. On the other hand, and as we look at the carnage in international financial markets this past week, if you're measuring a rising power on the basis of sovereign wealth fund, Singapore is going to count. Gulf states, who again by other measures wouldn't count, are going to count, and so on. Likewise, you then also have to fold into the equation non-state actors, be they terrorist groups or the international corporations. We exist, unfortunately, in a day and age in which a non-state actor has the ability to present an existential threat to a state. If a nuclear device were to go off in New York today, that would be a major problem for the United States, to say the least. And so, do you consider Al Qaeda to be a rising power because they can, in fact, potentially pose an existential threat to a state power? So I think it's a really interesting question and a very complicated question. I'm not sure, that I have all the answers. Beyond that, there are sort of the standard list of countries: China, India, the European Union as a conglomerate, Japan, the United States, Russia, who's clearly resurgent in world affairs, thanks in large part because of the revenues that they're now gaining from their natural resources. Brazil, South Africa, there's sort of the standard set of countries that everybody agrees, okay, well, we know that these 6, 8, 9 countries count as the major powers, the rising powers that are going to shape the world of the 21st century. After that, though, the agreement and consensus breaks down pretty quickly. I would say some of the salient characteristics that you would look for would be military power and the ability to project some amount of force beyond their own borders, if not necessarily globally, but at least some sort of regional military force. Global economic power is another is another factor, and that can be as a consumer, as a producer. There are a number of different ways in which you can take a cut at it. Maybe they're just lucky enough to be sitting on top of a whole heap of a natural resource like oil or gas. Diplomatic power is another factor that you can fold into the equation. There are countries that, by dint of intellectual capital, force of their example, manage to carry sway in world affairs, and there are middle powers. And Australia is a perfect example of that. That managed to punch above their weight in some ways in the international community because of their ability to very effectively work their diplomatic resources. Ideological power still counts. The attractiveness of the example and the idea that underlies that country. And this is obviously one of the great challenges for the United States and the world right now, is that we've always been a very attractive model and had a tremendous amount of ideological appeal to other countries, except for in the past several years we've managed to besmirch our good name, and now need to figure out how we're able to get back to a point where the power of our example and the attractiveness of our model of government and way of life is something that we can use to get traction and leverage in global affairs. I would add to the list cultural attractiveness. That maybe that's sort of a subset of the ideological power. But when you look at East Asia, for example, and you look at the attractiveness of South Korean pop stars in Japan, I mean that's this sort of cultural vitality plays a role as well. I'm sure I'm leaving things out, but I mean those are the sorts of factors that I would toss into the equation. Well, I mean, one of the interesting questions right now about China and China's future trajectory is, whether or not they are in fact pursuing a model of free market capitalist economy, authoritarian government, both internally and in terms of other regimes that they support in Asia and Africa and in Latin America. I mean, that may not rise to the sort of ideological challenge or conflict that we saw between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but I mean that's definitely an alternate model of how to govern and how to manage your economy and manage your people than one that I think most Americans would feel comfortable with and want to promote. And if in fact this sort of Beijing consensus approach is one that the Chinese do start to actively promote abroad. I mean, it's kind of hard to get a good handle on how active or how passive they are with their promotion right now. That's the sort of thing that could certainly be a challenge to the United States, depending upon how you include Al Qaeda's ideological model and what they're trying to do, and whether or not you would include Al Qaeda or other non-state actors in this sort of equation. Certainly a huge part of their quote-unquote appeal has to do purely with a sort of ideological, radical religious message that has certain implications for how they would like to see a large part of the world governed. That's an ideological challenge. I mean, at the end of the day, the fight between the United States and Al Qaeda is not a military battle, although there are certainly going to be aspects of it that are going to include the use of armed forces, intelligence assets, and whatnot. But it's an ideological battle, and they're playing for hearts and minds in Afghanistan and Pakistan, elsewhere in the Middle East, and that's a battle on sort of, in the realm of ideas that we have to be more effective in engaging in as well. I'm not sure I would say if there are battle lines per se forming. I mean, it's definitely an issue that there's a lot of debate about. I mean, from my perspective, I have sort of two problems with this. The idea of a league of democracies. Although, certainly I like democracy as much as the next guy, and I'm all for democracies, coming together and coordinating, consulting with each other in the conduct of their foreign policies. But I mean, the two stumbling blocks are, when you actually seek to operationalize foreign policy on the basis of shared democratic interests, things break down pretty quickly. When you look at the challenge that we face in Southeast Asia with Burma, for example, part of the problem certainly is China's orientation towards Burma, but a big part of the problem is the orientation of our democratic friends and allies, India, Japan, Thailand, and so forth. And so it's not at all clear that just being democracies and having that as a shared value is sufficient to override the other interests that guide nations in pursuing their foreign policy. You know, when we look at the Burma case, the stumbling block that we face in the UN doesn't come so much from China, although China, you know, has not been as helpful as I would hope they've been. It comes from South Africa, you know, a fellow democracy. It's come from you know, Vietnam and the Security Council, which, I mean, certainly isn't a democracy, but you know, is arguably on the glide path you know, in that direction. So I think there's sort of this operational problem. The second problem, you know, beyond that, is that when we look at the shared common global problems, like climate change, for example, that the international community faces, we're simply not going to be able to solve them unless we are able to engage effectively with all of the other major powers. And that includes those that are democracies and those that are not democracies. And if we approach problem solving, you know, through exclusive forums like a League of Democracies that, you know, would include only democratic countries and invariably and unavoidably exist in a state of tension with the major powers who aren't democracies, that's not going to lead to a situation in which we're going to be able to effectively come together and face these common problems through common policy. They haven't yet, and you know, we've seen that in the ongoing debates over UN Security Council reform, for example. You know, if these international institutions and these global intergovernmental organizations are going to be able to be effective and serve a functional problem-solving role in the 21st century, which at the end of the day, after all, is why they exist, they need to be able to reflect the power realities of the world as it is today, not as it was 60 years ago. And that's going to be a painful process to get from where we are right now to where we need to be. But if we can't do that, if these organizations don't have the necessary plasticity and elasticity to evolve, then they're going to become increasingly less and less relevant because they're simply not going to be able to drive decision making or provide the resources that are needed to solve the problems that they were created and exist to be able to solve. I'm going to cop out to some degree on the energy issue because I'm not a huge expert on it, but sort of my sort of 30-second you know, bit of wisdom, such as it may be, is that, you know, at the end of the day, whether it's energy or other natural resources, you know, there are certain concrete, real things that people and countries need in order to be able to survive and function. You know, energy is clearly one of those critical input factors that you need to be able to keep your country and keep your economy going. It's a finite resource, at least the way in which we currently you know, are organized. You know, and it's not only in terms of being, you know, the carbon base of our economy. It's not only a finite resource, but it's a resource that's concentrated in you know, a limited number of hands, which then creates all sorts of interesting you know, dynamics between the producers and the consumers of energy. You know, it's hard to imagine, for example, that Russia would be resurgent on the world stage in 2008 if it wasn't for the fact that we've had this massive run-up in energy prices over the past several years. You know, everything was heading in the wrong way for Russia by any objective measure throughout the 1990s and the early the early years of this century until energy prices turned around. You know, energy prices turned around. All of a sudden, Russia finds itself sitting flush on a large amount of money that they can then use to revitalize and modernize their military. As they do that, they've now started to flex their military muscle and send out some clear signals that they're back on the world stage. So I mean, there's quite a lot that flows from who controls energy resources in terms of how national power is constituted. One of the interesting challenges as I sort of look at how major powers are interacting on the world stage today is that our economies are very, very tightly tied together. One of the fascinating things for me about looking at some of the consumer product safety issues between the United States and China that have arisen over the past couple of years is there are any number of ways in which you can take a cut at the issue and make arguments about what China should be doing, what the United States should be doing, and so forth. But the bottom line of it is a sign of just how closely integrated and entwined the U.S. and Chinese economies have become. That in fact it's one unified supply chain in effect that unites our two countries. When you look at South Korea's economy, there's a very interesting correlation between Chinese exports to the United States and the strength of South Korea's economy. Not necessarily so much South Korean exports to China per se, but Chinese exports to the United States and the strength of South Korea's economy. That suggests that if the United States starts importing less from China, South Korea is going to feel it in terms of an economic slowdown. So there are all sorts of interesting interactions because of how tightly bound our economies have all become, and that in turn creates all sorts of interesting tensions and interesting challenges for policymakers. Getting back to some of the consumer product safety issues. Is the right response for the United States in dealing with some of these questions having to do with standards at Chinese manufacturing facilities to come down hard on China in the context of trade talks, or is it to recognize that because we have this economic integration that we actually need to be throwing more resources at our own Food and Drug Administration and Consumer Product Safety Commission to deal with the realities of what a globalized marketplace actually means for U.S. consumers, that we need to have more adequate domestic policy tools that to face the new reality of the international economy. One of the interesting features of the globalized economy is that we see sort of winners and losers, spread out very unevenly in different countries, because we're in effect developing not a U.S. elite, not a French or British or Japanese or South Korean or German elite, but a global elite, and so you have this global elite that operates internationally, and it bounces around from country to country, and then you have all the rest, wherever they may be, in Brazil, in the United States, in China, all competing against each other in a global, in a global workplace as well, and because you have now this exposure of the U.S. workforce to competition from China, from India, from wherever it may be in the world, there are tremendous forces to drive down pay for labor and whatnot in the United States that a U.S. workforce never previously had to be concerned about, and that goes the same for work, the workforce, no matter where it may be, and so you have these these dynamics that are driving greater social and economic stratification in pick your country, wherever it may be, and that's that's an issue. Some of these distributional issues are challenges that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. I don't think we've figured it out yet by any means. I think one of the miscalculations that the Bush administration made was that they predicated their national security policy and their approach to world affairs on the premise that the United States could be the preeminent predominant power in the world, and that we would brook, as I think they put it in the 2002 national security strategy, no peer competitors. That simply, and I think we've had ample empirical evidence of that over the past 6 years, that simply is not a sustainable approach given the new power dynamics that are at play in the world today. And so, I mean, following from that, I would recommend and I would hope that the next administration is going to adopt a national security strategy that takes into account the realities of how the globe is organized, where the different power centers are, and adopts a slightly more nuanced approach to developing effective U.S. leverage so that we can pursue our national interests, work with our friends and allies to do so wherever possible, and to bring about partnerships with those countries that we may not always see eye to eye with on every issue, but whose cooperation we need if we're going to be able to solve the challenges that face the world in the 21st century.